All right, welcome back to part 2. In part 2, we are going to define what specific praise is and how to use it effectively. So this is the first part of this middle 2 parts where we're really thinking about establishing a continuum of strategies to acknowledge appropriate behavior. And behavior-specific praise is the foundation of that continuum. It is the thing that needs to be present in every classroom and delivered to every kid. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time making sure we're really clear on what that is. And then in part 3, we'll give you some strategies to layer on some additional practices to help increase the rates of positive reinforcement in your classroom. So you'll remember that we're now in this middle phase where we're thinking about the positive and proactive practices that we can implement in our classroom. In Module 3, we talked about high rates of opportunities to respond, prompts and active supervision. And now we're talking about specific praise. So specific praise is exactly what it sounds like. It is giving praise that clearly names the behavior or the thing that we want to see more of. So it's things like the teacher saying thank you for raising your hand as opposed to just good, awesome, thank you. It's something like the teacher saying I really appreciate how you facilitated the group discussion when you were working together. The peers had lots of ideas and you really managed it well. It's telling the kids exactly what it is that you want to see more of. A non-example is something like sarcasm, something that is not sincere. We want to make sure that when we're delivering specific praise that it's given in a really sincere way. We're making sure we're really being clear with students. Think about it as good instructional feedback that helps them label the thing that we want to see more of, but it does need to be sincere and genuine. All right, so on the next slide, you're going to watch a quick video of Dr. Terry Scott delivering some specific praise statements. I'll give you some additional examples of what this looks like.
Okay, so that's what a cliche is. So here's what we're going to do next. I'd like you guys to work on the big sentence we were talking about. One complete sentence that uses a cliche. So when you want to use a cliche, you can always look up at the board at the things you've been doing or pick one of your own. So who has one that they'd like to use that, yeah?
How about quiet as a mouse?
Quiet as a mouse is perfect. That's a cliche. Now if you can't think of one of your own, you can always look up at the board. Or Rose, which one of these might you pick on yours?
Hard as a rock.
Hard as a rock, that's a good one. Okay, great, get out that paper and let's go.
After watching that video, we're now going to give you a little bit more information about the importance of using specific praise. So why do we use specific praise? There's a lot of research that supports its use. We know that using good specific praise or contingent praise improves academic behaviors. It also improves the social behaviors of the participants in a variety of different studies. And so you can see a lot of different research citations here. We're happy to provide more information on any of those pieces, but there is a lot of research that supports the use of contingent or specific praise in the classroom to support student academic and social behavior. We know that increasing the number of specific praise statements increases on-task behavior, and that when we pair it, it's a really easy strategy to pair with other things like another tangible or an additional strategy that we'll talk about in the next section of this module. When we pair those things up, we get increased appropriate behavior as well. So specific praise really is the foundation of what we're going to do in our classroom to acknowledge appropriate behavior. So we want to spend a little bit of time thinking about what this looks like. So we're going to walk through a workbook quiz. And we're going to give you a little bit of time to complete this in your workbook first, and then we'll walk through each of the examples and talk through the answers as we go. So first, when you think about the scenario that's in your workbook or on the PowerPoint, if you think it is an example of specific praise, circle the thumbs up. If you think it is not an example of specific praise, circle the thumbs down. We'll give you a little bit of time to complete that activity, and then we'll go through those activities together. All right, so let's see how you did on that quiz in your workbook. Is this specific praise? During educator-directed instruction, the student raises her hand. Educator says, thank you for raising your hand. You should have circled the thumbs up. This is a positive verbal statement. It comes immediately after the behavior, and it specifically names exactly what it was that we want to see more of from that student, in this case, raising your hand. So this is a good example of a specific praise statement. How about the next one? During educator-directed instruction, students are talking over the educator. The educator rolls his eyes and says, gee, thanks for listening. Hopefully you circled the thumbs down in this situation. This is sarcasm and is not specific praise. Remember, we talked about the importance of making sure that praise is genuine, and sarcasm is not that. That is not to say that sarcasm does not have a place in the classroom. It's just that it is not specific praise. Some of us are more sarcastic than others, and that is appropriate in some situations, but it should not be confused with specific praise. How about this next one? A student enters the class during educator-directed instruction. The student quietly walks to his or her seat. Educator walks over to the student and whispers, "Thanks for coming into the room quietly." Hopefully you circled thumbs up on this one. It is a positive verbal statement, came right after the behavior, and it specifically named that expected behavior, in this case coming into the room quietly. How about this one? Student enters the class during educator-directed instruction, walks over to his seat. Educator gives the student a thumbs up to recognize that quiet entry. This is not a specific praise statement. It's a little tricky because it's thumbs up. It's positive, but it's not specific. It doesn't let the kid know exactly what it was that they're getting the thumbs up for. So this is not an example of specific praise. It would be considered general praise. How about this one? During educator-directed instruction, one student is poking and attempting to talk with another student who responds by showing the class quiet symbol. The educator immediately looks at the second student, gives a thumbs up sign, and mouths, "Thank you for paying attention." This is an example of specific praise. Again, it's coming right after that behavior. It specifically names the behavior that we want to see more of. How about this one? During educator-directed instruction, that same student is poking another student. The other student responds by showing the class quiet symbol. About a minute later, the teacher looks at the second student, smiles, and says, "Good job." This is not an example of specific praise. Again, this isn't specific. The good job piece is positive, but it doesn't tell the student exactly what they did well. It's also not entirely contingent because it's coming a little bit after the behavior occurred. With little kids or with some kids with disabilities, it's really important to make sure that our response, our acknowledgement comes really quickly after the behavior we want to see more of. With some older students or some higher functioning students, we have a little bit more wiggle room because they can remember what happened a little while back and they can say, "Oh yeah, early on in the period, thank you for paying attention during that time," and they'll remember what it was that they did. But it's more powerful if that response comes right after they engage in the behavior. How about this one? After a student identifies that she or he is upset and selects a specific self-calming strategy, the educator says you did a really nice job of identifying that you were upset and choosing the strategy that helped you calm down. That is an example of positive, specific praise. It names the specific behavior we want to see more of, and it came immediately after the behavior. So that is a good example. And how about this one? During direct instruction, the educator points to the consonant blend TH, which is underlined in the word though, and says, "What sound?" That's right. This is not a specific praise statement. You should recognize this as an opportunity to respond, which we talked about in the last module. And this example, after the student responds correctly by explaining the concept of conservation of energy, the teacher says, "Nice job, including all the major points in your answer." That's right. This one is a good example of specific praise. It specifically names what it was that the student did well. And in this example, during a physics lesson, the educator asked groups of students to work together to explain the concept of the conservation of energy. That's right. This one is another opportunity to respond. It is not specific praise. So how'd you do on that quiz? Hopefully you did well, and hopefully that helped clarify some examples and non-examples of specific praise for you. To sum it up, we know that specific praise is a verbal statement because it has to be verbal in some way in order to be specific. That's not to say you can't write a note for some students because that could also be considered verbal, but thinking about a way to actually give specific feedback requires some sort of verbal or written response. It should be delivered immediately after the behavior, especially for young students or those with disabilities, and it should specifically state the desired behavior that the student engaged in. So we're giving good instructional feedback in this situation. And if you use any other rewards, like a token or a ticket or something like that in your classroom, remember to pair that with the use of specific praise, that it's not the delivery of the token or the ticket that is the reinforcer. It's actually important to link that with the specific praise that comes with it to help the student learn why they're getting that token in the first place and help them understand what it is that they engaged in to help earn that. So we're going to pause and ask you to think a little bit with a quick stop and jot activity about how you could use specific praise in your classroom. So I want you to actually think about your classroom setting or a classroom in which you've been a part of, and script out, write down 3 or more specific praise statements that you will use in your classroom to recognize appropriate social behavior. So think about your specific students, the patterns of behavior that they engage in, identify a behavior that you want to see more of in your classroom, and think about how you can appropriately acknowledge a student when they engage in that behavior. And just as importantly, think about how you can modify your use of those based on the student's learning history, the setting, or their abilities. So thinking about a student for whom positive verbal praise from the teacher might not actually serve as reinforcing, how could you deliver that exact same feedback in a different way, using a sticky note or a quiet conversation instead of public praise, or things like that. So think about how you can adapt this strategy for the particular students in your classroom and their needs. So take a few minutes and write down some of those activities, and we'll be back in just a minute. All right, welcome back from activity 4.3. You wrote down a couple of examples of specific praise statements that you're going to use in your classroom setting. Just take a minute and double check to make sure that each of them clearly names the behavior that you want to see more of. And then quickly double check to make sure you thought about some strategies or how you might modify those strategies for the individual students in your classroom. And then think specifically about this one. How might you take one of those specific praise statements that you wrote down in your workbook and modify it for a kid who preferred private or nonverbal feedback? You might consider something like a quiet conversation or catching the student during a transition and just letting them know quietly that you recognize that they were engaged in appropriate behavior.